Scene 1. The summoning of 12 somewhere beyond stars, beyond time, beyond reason. There exists a place the living do not go. Not by boat, not by prayer, not even by death. It is a chamber that does not obey gravity, nor architecture, nor common decency in its interior design. A circular room the size of a cathedral, hung in the sky as though the cosmos themselves had forgotten to tether it to anything real. Tira Misu stood in the middle of it. She had woken up here, fully clothed, holding a slightly smudged ink pen and a half-open diary that now floated beside her, as if unsure where else to be. She was the only mortal in the room, something she could feel not just in her bones, but in her existence, like a paper lantern among bonfires. The walls pulsed gently with golden runes and shifting constellations. Seats of various styles, wooden thrones, lotus mats, clouds, a mechanical folding chair, circled the room. Above them, a balcony of stars blinked, and below them there was nothing. Just void, polite and endless. "Welcome, dear jurors," came a voice, velvet and amused, from nowhere and everywhere. A figure appeared at the center of the chamber in a puff of stardust and dry erase marker smell. Robed in shifting pixels, with a monocle that refused to stay on one eye, the dungeon master raised a hand. Behind him floated a translucent screen where words appeared as he spoke. "Today we gather for a trial most delicate and divine. A mortal stands accused, not of theft, nor murder, nor taxation fraud, but of the gravest of spiritual crimes." The screen behind him flashed in bold, "the sin of non-belief." Gasps were heard. Well, one was a gasp. One was a thunderclap. One sounded suspiciously like a sheep bleating in distress. Tira swallowed hard. The dungeon master continued, pacing as if he were about to start a PowerPoint. "The accused claims to believe in nothing. No divine authority, no cosmic plan. No deities, no doctrines, no diagrams of chakras. Just atoms, ethics, and existential anxiety." "Sounds like my ex," muttered a deep voice from one of the thrones. "A golden man with a beard too regal to be questioned, Zeus, probably." Another voice, softer, warmer. "And yet they live with compassion." Jesus seated cross-legged on a floating rug, his eyes already sad. Tira sat in the one empty seat, a simple wooden chair, slightly wobbly. It creaked as if sharing her discomfort. The dungeon master pointed his staff, which may have once been a pool cue, to the blank center of the room. A glowing figure appeared, genderless, featureless. The accused, not there to speak, only to symbolize. They will not speak. This trial is not for them, but for you. The burden of belief rests on your divine shoulders. From across the room, a warrior slammed a spear into the floor. "Odin, we judge a soul for failing to kneel? Let them kneel before the gallows instead." Buddha raised one eyebrow. Krishna grinned like someone who had already read the ending. The dungeon master spun on his heel. "The 12 of you have been chosen to represent the spectrum of belief across realms, ages, pantheons, and paradigms." A whisper of silk announced the presence of Laozi, whose feet may or may not have touched the floor. A scroll unraveled in the DM's hands. "The jurors are as follows: Jesus of Nazareth, Moses of Sinai, Mohammad of Mecca, Krishna of Vrindavan, Gautama Buddha, Xenu the unbelievably persistent, Joseph Smith the restored, Odin Allfather, Zeus Olympios, Ahura Mazda of light, Laozi of the way." And he paused. All heads turned. Tira Misu. Mortal, female, confused. Tira winced. She could feel the weight of divine scrutiny press down on her like an avalanche of incense and expectation. She looked around. Jesus smiled at her kindly. Moses squinted suspiciously. Xenu was building a small pyramid out of invisible bricks. Why me? She wondered. Why put a mortal in a room full of gods? But she already knew. It was the same reason she kept writing in her diary. Sometimes the only way to understand the world was to sit with it and ask the impossible. The dungeon master clapped, literally with a slow-building echo. "Let the deliberations begin. Each of you will vote, guilty or not guilty. Unanimity is required. No hung juries in heaven or otherwise. You may persuade one another, roll for influence, quote yourselves excessively, or ponder the metaphysical void together over imaginary tea. But in the end you must agree." He stepped back and summoned a 20-sided die with an extravagant gesture. "Also," he added, tossing it into the air, "the laws of persuasion are a bit fluid here." The die spun. Tira watched it land. A nat 20. The DM winced. "May the rolls be ever in your favor." And with that the chamber dimmed. The jury, divine and human, turned toward the sender. The accused waited silently. The question had been cast. Tira held her pen tightly. Somewhere in the margin of her diary she scribbled a single line. What if belief isn't a gate, but a mirror? The trial had begun. Scene 2. The first deliberation, the dungeon master struck his gavel, which suspiciously resembled a rubber chicken dipped in starlight, and cleared his throat. Let us commence the initial vote. Guilty or not guilty, no arguments yet. Just your instinct, your divine knee-jerk reaction, if you will. Each juror raised a hand or nodded solemnly. Guilty, Moses, Mohammad, Xenu, Joseph Smith, Odin, Zeus, Ahura, Mazda. Not guilty, Jesus, Krishna, Buddha, Laozi, Tira. The dungeon master jotted the tally on his floating chalkboard. 5-7, mortal mercy versus divine decree. Let the debates begin. Tira blinked uncertain. The words "not guilty" had simply slipped from her mouth before she had a chance to think. Assuming the punishment for non-belief was eternal, it felt wrong to judge a nameless someone so callously. Moses was the first to rise. The law is not ambiguous. It is written, "Thou shalt have no other gods before me." To deny the existence of God is to reject the very foundation of moral order. If we do not uphold the law, we invite chaos. Krishna leaned back with a chuckle. Ah, but chaos can be very instructive, no? The mortal in question has not stolen, nor harmed, nor cursed. They have simply wandered. Moses' brow darkened. To wander from truth is still to be lost. The dungeon master rolled a die behind his screen. It clattered with significance. Persuasion roll, 5-0, stirred. Jesus stood. His gaze swept the room like wind over a field. I voted not guilty, not because the law is unimportant, but because love is greater still. If this soul lives with compassion, perhaps they are closer to heaven than those who use belief as a shield for cruelty. Odin scoffed, "Compassion without loyalty is weakness." Or perhaps it's courage, Jesus replied softly. Dice roll, 18, Joseph Smith frowned. He shifted slightly in his chair. Joseph Smith spoke next. There is merit in what the Nazarene says, but I believe in continuing revelation. Without faith, what light is there to guide us? What light is brighter than an honest heart? Asked Buddha, not unkindly. Joseph looked startled. But how can you know what is honest if not through faith in the divine? Buddha closed his eyes. One may arrive at clarity through silence, through understanding the self. Dice roll, 13, a ripple passed through Mohammad. He adjusted his robe contemplative. Mohammad rose. His voice was steady like a river flowing between firm banks. Faith is the lens through which we perceive the divine. But it is also a covenant. This mortal has broken that trust. Yet I do not speak from wrath. My vote is guilty, but not without sadness. Tira opened her mouth gently. But if they never made the covenant? She was immediately interrupted by Xenu, who stood up and flung a glowing orb onto the floor, where it burst into holographic schematics of thetans, volcanoes, and suspiciously copyright-safe space cruisers. This trial is clearly a suppression tactic orchestrated by the engram-infested overlords of Sector 9. Everyone stared. He jabbed a finger at the accused. Their ignorance is a product of spiritual trauma. We must purge it, not forgive it. Dice roll, natural 1, the orb fizzled. His pyramid collapsed. Krishna clapped politely. Bravo, a masterclass in confusion. Ahura Mazda stood with gravitas. There is right and there is wrong. The soul must choose the path of light. To refuse belief is to turn away from righteousness. Buddha lifted an eyebrow. And who defines light if not the self seeking it? Zeus grunted. This is boring. Condemn the mortal, move on. Dice roll, 10, Odin nodded. Zeus is brutish, but not wrong. Mortals exist to serve or die trying. If they will not bend the knee, they must break. Tira scribbled notes frantically. Odin equates disobedience with dishonor. Belief equals submission. She cleared her throat again. Perhaps belief is more of a process. Process is for bread dough, Zeus barked. Tira closed her mouth. Laozi finally spoke, or perhaps breathed, the words, "The way flows around labels." A soul who knows not the name of God may still walk in step with the Tao. Jesus smiled. Buddha gave a subtle nod. Dice roll, 19, Ahura Mazda looked thoughtful. The dungeon master clapped suddenly. A strong opening round, emotions flare. Minds stir. Dice roll, shall we keep score? No, but I will doodle little stars beside particularly spicy arguments. He drew a star beside Jesus, a question mark beside Xenu, and a frowny face next to Odin. Tira tried again. Maybe it's not about what they believe, but why they believe or disbelieve it. She looked around, but again her voice was lost under the sound of Moses and Krishna debating over free will. Krishna twirled a flower between his fingers. To act out of duty yet detached from result that is divine. Does this mortal not live this way? Moses slammed his staff into the floor. Detached duty is apathy in disguise. We are commanded to believe, not to experiment. Dice roll, 6-4 minimal effect. But Tira smiled quietly. The arguments were landing, even if the ground trembled beneath them. The dungeon master leaned back on his chair, which teetered dangerously on nothing. And so the tides begin to shift, subtly, invisibly, like a fart in a monastery. The divine masculine figures laughed. Tira's eyebrows rose at the unexpected, crude remark and even more unexpected reaction. And in the back of her mind, Tira wrote, "Truth does not always shout. Sometimes it waits for silence." The deliberation had only just begun. Scene 3. What is belief? The dungeon master, now floating upside down and scribbling notes into a constellation-shaped notepad, offered a lazy flourish of his hand. Let us dig deeper, shall we? What is belief? A map, a melody, a malfunction? Interpret it as you will. He spun a die midair, caught it, and nodded. Proceed. Jesus stood with quiet purpose. His eyes held a sadness not of weakness, but of having seen too much love twisted by too much fear. Belief is not simply recitation. It is the act of loving, even when love is not returned. It is feeding the hungry, tending the broken, offering grace where judgment tempts. If the mortal in question has lived with compassion, then what more do we seek? There was silence. Dice roll 17. The ripple was instant. Ahura Mazda, once rigid, blinked slowly, his glow dimming just a shade. His eyes, which had burned with absolute judgment, now flickered with curiosity. Tira felt something settle in her chest. "There's strength in gentleness," she scribbled. "Why is that so easy to forget?" Krishna twirled a peacock feather between two fingers. "We must not confuse the absence of formal faith with absence of spirit. The world is a dance, and the mortal? They've simply missed the choreography. That does not mean they lack rhythm." Zeus squinted. "Are we judging a mortal or auditioning for a talent show?" Krishna winked. "Perhaps both." Dice roll, 14. Joseph Smith scratched his chin. "There's something in that. The idea that faith might begin before it finds a name." Buddha rose. His voice was soft but grounded. "The root of suffering is attachment. The root of compassion is understanding. This mortal lives without certainty but chooses kindness. In my path that is a form of awakening." Mohammad frowned. "But what path leads to truth if not through God?" Buddha bowed his head. "There are many rivers. Not all run the same course, still all lead to the sea." Dice roll, 16. Joseph Smith looked troubled. His eyes darted to Jesus, Krishna, then to Tira, who hadn't spoken, but had listened more closely than any of them. He sighed. "I was taught that truth is revealed through divine channels. But maybe this soul has not yet received their moment of revelation. That does not mean it will not come." The dungeon master scribbled a little star next to Joseph's name. "Vote shift Joseph Smith, not guilty the tally, 6 not guilty, 6 guilty." Ahura Mazda spoke again, slower this time. "Perhaps I have been too swift. If the soul reflects light, even without naming its source, then maybe it has not rejected goodness." Vote shift Ahura Mazda, not guilty 7, not guilty 5 guilty. The tide had turned. Tira's pulse quickened. She wanted to say something, but the moment was fragile. Instead, she wrote, "What if faith isn't always knowing, but moving forward without it?" Moses stood abruptly. "This is a dangerous sentiment. Without belief in the divine, we are beasts. The law exists to prevent descent into chaos." Krishna smiled. "And yet the law must bend, or it will break." Moses slammed his staff down. "The law bends for no one." Dice roll, 6. Krishna. "Pity. Even trees bend in the wind." Zeus, now half dozing, stirred. "Over 117 billion humans. We're spending way too much time on this one." The DM scribbled a lightning bolt doodle. Xenu, emerging from a self-imposed trance, added, I have calculated their lack of belief is due to ancient intergalactic mind suppression by the Crab Nebula Syndicate. It's all very technical. Jesus blinked. That means nothing. Dice roll. Xenu 2, his guilt-ometer exploded. Despite the chaos, Tira noticed Buddha smile quietly at her, a knowing look. Belief is like silence, she wrote. You only notice it's missing when the noise is too loud. The dungeon master turned a page. And thus ends our first major motion. A few minds swayed, a few stubbornly unbudged, but the balance has shifted. 7 believe the mortal is worthy of mercy. 5 hold firm to justice. He tapped the chalkboard. As the dice roll, so does fate. Onward we go. Scene 4. What is justice? The chamber had grown quieter. Not in peace, but in pressure. The kind of stillness that comes before a storm. Moses was the first to break it. What you call mercy, he said, rising, may be indulgence. And indulgence corrupts the soul. The law is not a sentiment, it is a structure. Without it, all righteousness collapses. He looked to Joseph Smith and Ahura Mazda pointedly. You both know the consequences of undermining divine order. Joseph Smith fidgeted. Ahura Mazda's eyes narrowed. Dice roll. 15. Both divine men visibly shifted. Joseph leaned forward, folding his hands. Ahura Mazda's glow regained its sharpness. Tira felt the temperature drop. Mohammad stood next. Compassion is important, but justice does not exist without boundaries. Belief is not a feeling, it is an agreement. A covenant. To live without it is to reject that bond. His words weren't angry, but they were unyielding. Dice roll. 17. Ahura Mazda spoke, voice firm. I revoke my previous change. I return to guilty. Vote shift. Ahura Mazda. Guilty Zeus clapped sarcastically. Justice. Ah, the eternal justification for divine temper tantrums. You have no reverence, muttered Moses. Zeus stretched. I have no patience. There's a difference. Joseph Smith, visibly torn, sighed. Perhaps I was too moved by sentiment. Justice must be stable, predictable. A universe without it is chaos. He turned back. Vote shift. Joseph Smith, guilty 7, not guilty, becomes 5. Odin rose slowly. His spear scraped the marble with a sound that felt ancient. Justice is not mercy, it is the weight of choices. The gods reward honor and punish betrayal. To live faithless is to spit in the eye of creation. Tira flinched at his words. They felt aimed at her. Dice roll. 16. Krishna frowned. Laozi said nothing. Buddha finally stood. Justice without understanding is cruelty with good intentions. He raised his hand. Dice roll. 5. The words fell into a silence that did not accept them. Krishna rose next, trying to smile. Perhaps we must remember, justice too can play. Dice roll. 7. No laughter, only steel. Laozi at last whispered, justice that forces the river to flow backward only floods the field. Dice roll. 6. Even Jesus looked weary. Zeus grinned. Well, look who's winning the morality match. Us, the fun gods. He raised a goblet of something glowing and suspicious. To the 117 billion souls who've passed through the cosmos, and to the one who dared not believe. Let's wrap this up, JC. You bled for them, and they still reject you. Roll 9. Tira sat motionless. Around her, the winds of certainty screamed. Jesus closed his eyes and raised his hand, which bore the holes where nails had pierced him. He did not speak. Vote update. 11 guilty, 1 not guilty. Only Tira remained. The dungeon master spoke at last with an oddly gentle tone. And thus the trial reaches its precipice. All but one have judged the mortal unworthy. He floated downward, now eye level with Tira. Not that it matters. One soul among 117 billion. What's one more question in an ocean of answers? Tira looked down at her diary, failing to meet the gazes of the gods. Scene 5. Challenging the gods. The silence was suffocating. Tira stood alone. 11 divine voices had spoken. All had rendered judgment. Only she remained unconvinced. Only she held the line, not because she was certain, but because she wasn't. And somehow that felt important. The dungeon master hovered quietly, eyes dim. No clever quips, no dice rolls. Just the slow tension of breath not yet taken. Tira stood. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. You've all said your piece, she began, diary still clutched in her hand. And I've listened. I've tried to understand every argument, every law, every declaration of justice. She turned slowly, looking at each of them. But you speak as though you've forgotten what it means to be human. She looked to Moses. You say the law is sacred. But laws are shaped by hands, passed through voices, interpreted by scribes. If the law condemns those who never had a chance to know it, who never spoke directly to God as you have, then is that justice or exclusion? He opened his mouth, then closed it. To Mohammad, she said, you speak of covenant, but how can a promise be broken if it was never made? The mortal never rejected God. They simply didn't know God was actually there. They inherited a convenient, but were not there to sign their name. His eyes searched hers. He said nothing. To Odin, you value strength, but you mistake silence for cowardice. Sometimes the greatest strength is in not pretending to be sure. I learn something new every day. There is beauty in being a lifelong student. She turned to Zeus, who was in mid-sip of his glowing drink. And you, 117 billion humans, so you can go home to do what exactly? That's your argument, that one life is disposable. Why create that many lives to begin with if each one is expendable? What makes you a god? Is it simply to have worshippers? For what purpose? He shifted uncomfortably. To Ahura Mazda, you speak of light and darkness. But what if the path to the light includes shadows? Should we punish someone for not sprinting when they've only just begun to crawl? Her voice grew steadier. I'm just a mortal. I'm not perfect. I never was. I never will be. I don't think anyone is. But if perfection is the price of mercy, then it isn't mercy. It's elitism. She turned to the once not guilty jurors. You taught me belief can take many forms: action, stillness, doubt. And you, she gestured to the core members of the guilty side, you taught me belief also needs discipline. I don't reject that, but if belief is so important, why not make it easier to reach? If your system leaves most people behind, maybe it's not the people who need fixing. Perhaps it's the system. No one moved. She lowered her gaze. You say all the mortal had to do was believe. But how could they? Until now, I didn't even believe you were real. She glanced specifically at Xenu. Xenu is using marshmallows to try and summon a comet. I'm still considering the possibility that this is all a dream. The gods collectively glanced at Xenu, who was in fact whispering secrets to a marshmallow tower. So I ask you all, Tira's voice broke slightly, then steadied, what makes a soul worthy? Is it belief in power or belief in kindness? She looked up. Because if we say that this mortal is unworthy, not for cruelty, not for malice, but for not seeing what they couldn't see, then you aren't benevolent gods. You're tyrants. Blood rushed to her head as she felt hell's flames in the gaze of her adversaries. Silence. A single sound echoed through the chamber. Click. The dungeon master rolled the die. It danced, spun, tumbled, natural 20. The chamber seemed to exhale. Jesus smiled first. She sees clearly, though she doubts. I change my vote not to sway others, but to honor her truth. Not guilty, said Krishna, eyes twinkling. For this play the mortal deserves an encore. Not guilty, Buddha whispered. Suffering ends not in punishment, but in compassion. Laozi nodded, a leaf drifting down a river. Joseph Smith, not guilty. I forgot that faith begins in not knowing. Ahura Mazda, not guilty. The light has found her. Mohammad, not guilty. Her words honor the spirit, if not the letter. Moses, a long pause, then softly, not guilty. The law must serve the people, not condemn them. Odin grunted. Fine, let her live. I admire her fire. Zeus, not guilty. But only because she had the guts to roast me, and I respect that. Xenu, not guilty. The marshmallows have spoken. The final vote, unanimous, not guilty. The dungeon master swung the chicken gavel. And thus concludes the mock trial. The mortal has already passed on long ago. They never heard your verdict. Gasps confusion, he held up a finger. This trial was never for them, it was for you. This was a test to see if you were worthy. Tira looked around. Some gods vanished into the mist, others lingered. She turned to the DM if I'm worthy, still considering the words as she asked them. He tilted his head. As Zeus said, it takes real guts to stand up to the gods. In the true afterlife, we're looking for leaders, not followers. It's a middle management position, but there's still room for promotion in heaven, although you could refuse and simply end up with everyone else. She thought for a moment, then smiled. Scene 6, the diary. The sound of a ticking clock replaced the silent starlight. Tira Misu sat cross-legged on her bed, notebook in her lap, pen poised but unmoving. Her bedroom was small, cluttered in a cozy way, half-written pages strewn across a quilted blanket, a mug of cold tea forgotten on the windowsill. The moonlight pooled on her desk, catching on the surface of a single item, a 20-sided die resting beside her lamp. She glanced at it and smiled softly. She tapped the pen against her lip and read over the latest passage in her diary. It was sprawling, messy, full of ink stains and rewrites about divine figures and a jury trial. It felt important but impossible to communicate. She tried to recount it all, the gods, their voices, the accused atheist. Zeus's thunderous sarcasm, Buddha's silent patience, the unreadable look in Mohammed's eyes. Xenu had made an appearance too, somehow. The questions still circled in her head. What is belief? What is justice? What does it mean to be a god? What does it mean to be human in a world where gods disagree on how to judge us? She wondered if any of the 117 billion humans had truly found the answers, or if time was the tide that ebbed and flowed, life and then death. What if everything is simply connected by the evolution of cultures and theories? She thought about extinct gods, forgotten rituals, people who once wept and prayed and laughed in temples that now slept beneath dirt and moss. She thought about new faiths, ones yet to be born, whispered into existence by someone not yet breathing. The next generation, borrowing ideas from their ancestors, spinning their own truths on an interconnected tapestry, reimagining old portraits with new brushes, always chasing a feeling that was inherited like a bedtime story, never to be seen without fog, or identified simply, and yet the chase itself is still meaningful. She thought about how fragile everything was, and from this perspective how beautifully sacred. Tira exhaled, then scribbled a final line with slow care. Belief is not a gate, it's a mirror.